Thank you so much for the warm welcome and for filling the whole house here. It's amazing that you all want to here, after all of these years we are here, still come and listen to this nerd stuff we are presenting every year. I just go to the next slide. We've doing talks at Camera Image for a long time, and all of that talks, they were actually building up to something. So we had a secret master plan. And when I talk we, it's Andy Minuth, colorist and product specialist at FilmLight, and me, Daniele, and I'm an image engineer at FilmLight. And we were working on this kind of endeavor of look development and a new approach for almost a decade. And while we were kind of cracking one part of the puzzle, we always kind of packed it into a camera image talk and talked about that one little subject within the greater scheme of things. And for the last 2 or 3 years, we always wanted to actually present the tool, but it was never really ready yet. So and this time, especially the second part, Andy, he will actually then show what this decade of researching around the look of an image brought us to. Good news is it's very simple to use, so it's not complicated. That's good. But the first part will be me talking about the thinking behind the tooling and about what a look is and what we have found out basically. And Andy then in the second part will then do an actual hands-on and show that stuff, and will produce, I guess, a look from scratch maybe and show the actual tools. Okay, let's get into it. All right, so the first thing we kind of learned, I mean, we tried with our color management to be always as objective as possible and not to put any look into the image pipeline. Also, we always said like TCAM is a very neutral color rendering engine and so on. But we realized on this long journey that there is actually not such a thing as no look. As soon as you take an image, you impose a look onto it. And the only choice you can make is either you manage the look yourself, or you are at the mercy of the color management workflow, the camera manufacturer's color science, and then it's more like a random thing. So this is something which is really a key element we understood. And this is also very important for documentary when you say like you want to actually take a picture which represents what we saw on set. But actually this is not possible. And if we go to a very different room, not the grading room, but the courtroom, when in the courtroom images are used for creating evidence for a crime or something, that's exactly that same aspect is really highly debated. It's like you cannot really, with a picture of a scene, create the same perception in the jury's mind and represent or recreate what someone within the scene has actually perceived. And this is very, very crucial, and so this is just a proof that this is not something we came up with, but it's highly debated in other, it's not an industry really, in other fields as well. So seeing is actually deceiving, and the perception is not what color scientists try to explain to you, is not defined by the physical characteristics of the scene and the image, but heavily also influenced by the intentions and the goals, and seeing is a function of knowledge, expectation, goals, and also concurrent tasks. So it's impossible, going back to the courtrooms situation, it's impossible to simulate what was seen in an actual scene or crime scene in the courtroom's jury's minds. Pictures are bound to misrepresent what a viewer would perceive. So photography is an abstraction from reality. And this is exactly where we here all celebrating cinematography, where we put all of our creativity in, is actually how do we abstract from reality? And that abstraction actually then leads to immersion. So it's actually the antithesis to what the display manufacturers might tell you, that the wider gamut, the more dynamic range, the closer we get the color pipeline to reproduce the same XYZ code value or the XYZ values on a display, the more we get immersed because we see reality. We truly believe, and all of those movies that are shown here actually prove this, is that we get actually the immersion through the abstraction from reality. So the look is not created in a grading system. It's the whole thing, what you put in front of the camera, the costume maker, props, location, how you light the scene, the optical filters, the lenses, how you move the camera, the perspective, what format you acquire. But a camera doesn't produce an image. A camera collects data from the scene. And that data needs to be developed into an image. So a crucial part after you captured that, and if I take the word from film, the latent image. So it's not an image yet, it's almost an image, but we need to develop it. And that is a crucial part in this visual development process. And this is, I think, how we need to understand nowadays that whole digital development pipeline, how we are phrasing it here. And of course, that is supervised by the director of photography. And in collaboration with the colorist, that last part, actually taking the data that a camera captures and develop it with digital tools nowadays to an image. That is what we were looking at the last decade. So the motion picture development pipeline is a complex beast when it runs through a lot of building processes, building blocks, and transformations and inverse transformations and scales up and down. And there can be done a lot of things wrong. And but what we are talking about is only inside of the post-production side of things and deeply embedded into color management. There is room for the look development process. And that's why we started also 10 years ago with like explaining the color science, the color management part of the pipeline, because without that, you cannot actually engage in look development. You need to do your homeworks and have a well-understood pipeline before you then really can think about look development. And of course, that whole process here is then for a live pre-visualization baked into a lookup table. But I want to stress out that this lookup table that you get from post-production when you're shooting, that log 2, rec 7 or 9 LUT, is not the look itself. It's the look development embedded in technical and other kind of processes, and it's baked together. And typically, if it's a much better situation if you have that still open in the grading process. And I think Andy will also show you a little bit about this. Okay, so if you look at, and this is a really qualitative diagram, if we look at the area of electronic and then digital color grading, I think we can and if we look at this from left to right in time, and the Y scale is maybe the preference or the quality of the image. We started with color grading music videos and other electronically acquired media. And the way the cameras were set up and the pipeline was set up, that led to a certain look. And this is nowadays referred to the video look. Then in DI, when DI came in around 2005 and a decade of that, then the film look arose, because we shot on film, we scanned it, and then we printed it back, lasered it back to film, and this was considered as aesthetically very, very pleasing. But then we got like digital cameras in the field, and we treated them, because they were digital, differently than the DI process. And so at the beginning, the colors and the images that resulted out of that were not so pleasing. And then we tried, everyone tried a little bit to get a good-looking image in a digital pipeline, but there was a certain kind of plateau where we couldn't actually beat or be as good in terms of, I mean, I'll be very vague now, as film. But so what happened is that probably the last 10 years we were pivoting back to the film look. So we try to apply the film look to digital media. And that is basically what is the overall look. If over the last decade, if you look around, that is basically what dictates or what is the look of that last decade. How did we do that? How did we get a digital camera and got a film look on it? And actually, we used a print film emulation lookup table. And I brought one with me today for you, just because maybe some of you have never seen a lookup table. I brought one with me. So how this was actually created. It's not a file on disk, that's the end result, but the actual lookup table is when you take film, and what you do is you, takes a second. Here it starts. I don't know if you can see this. So what we did in the film labs, do you see this? So what we did is we lasered 4,096 patches of the Signon color space onto film, and then that were the inputs of the LUT. So this is the 16 by 16 by 16 inputs, and what we then did is we printed it onto print film, and then there was a poor guy in the film lab. I did this twice. It's really boring. you put this on a densitometer like this, and then you go like chick, 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 and then you're thinking about something else, and you're like, oh, did I do this already? Oh fuck! Let's do it again. Tick, tick. That's why there is this kind of like random kind of split in between. You see, like you have some yellows and then some reds. And this is just an error correction to see, like, oh, if you have 5 reds, then you measured one twice. So this is like, that's why it has this weird pattern here. So and this basically was then in the digital world, this became then the lookup table basically, because we know what we get in and we know the densities we get out, and then we could model at least the print side of things. This will take a while. I'll do it later. So the pros was that this was actually, this gave us all the magic that happened in the chemicals, at least on the print side of things. And there was basically, a lot of the look was embedded in there. But there were some issues with that. There were like a severe limitation in terms of dynamic range, because the dynamic range of that physical thing dictated the dynamic range of your pipeline. It was limiting in workflows, mainly because once you have done this work, this tedious work of capturing it, you wanted to keep it for yourself. You didn't want to give it someone else because you knew in that time that this was the magic, how to produce nice colors. Nowadays, everyone has a secret lookup table in his pockets and say like, oh, I have my secret LUT. But I can tell you there are only 5 LUTs that all of the LUTs you are having are basically mutated from. There is the ARRI Universal Cube that comes with the ARRI scanner. There is a Photocam Cube which was leaked, and there are the TrueLight Film generic, that's a Kodak one, and the Fuji one, and there's another one. Which one is this? The one from that Lars Borg did it, and then went in from Photoshop to Iridas and then into Resolve. But really, what we're all circling around are basically a mixture of these 5 UR lookup tables. And because those ones were really noisy, the ones you did actually for calibrating an actual film lab, and it had all of those dirty bumps that the actual film lab had. So the other ones were smoothed out and generic. Okay, but what was really bugging us is that you gained no deeper understanding of what do we actually like and why do we like it. So basically, this is this is how it happened. So we took a scan, and then later also a logarithmically encoded image, and then we took that lookup table, the digital version of that thing, and we slapped it onto the image, and like, oh, looks good. So this is basically how we apply the film look with that kind of trick to digital images. And this was also one of the success stories of the ARRI camera, because the log-C encoding was representing itself so that it fitted very nice with this kind of workflows, because the engineers at ARRI knew if we do that, and then at the beginning there was even a film gamut and a white gamut, and so they knew that it would naturally fit together if the digital files would present themselves as very similar to scans. So this was one of the great, one of the many successes, I think, that lead to the popularity of that camera. What then happened is, to overcome some of those problems, what we did here, and we are guilty as well, we took those data and we did some clever mathematical fitting exercises and extended the dynamic range, trying to keep the characteristics, the overall characteristics of that rendering, but extended into the highlights and into the shadows and also into the purity of colors, so to overcome the dynamic range and the workflow issues. Still, that whole process was LUT-based. And also, we did have no profound understanding of the look process. And this is how it looked like. So you started with an image that is already viewed through a clean pipeline, but in the scene referred domain, you basically apply a transform that goes from log to log, and it does not reduce the dynamic range. But the objection of that was, if we do a butterfly, and if I go with the cursor 1 to that thing here. So this is basically on the left side we see the let's say DI approach, where you just apply that lookup table onto an image, and here is on the other cursor is like that extrapolation where you can also do HDR and things. But the objection was that if we compare the images, they should basically look very similar. So this was the actual objection we have. And yeah, we achieved that. So that led to also taking the film look be ported to HDR productions. And really, the last 10 years, we see that overall arc of visual quality that is dictated by this kinds of workflows. And don't get me wrong, it's beautiful images, and it does something to us if we see images rendered in such a way. But we were thinking, like, this cannot be the end thing, right? We cannot, like, in 20 years just like still use emulate film blindly. Maybe we need to look further, and maybe at some point we will find a route and a framework where we can produce images which are even more pleasing in some respect, or give us at least more creative freedom. So that was basically what we wanted to do. We did not want to treat film as a black box, but actually understand what we like about film. And if we wanted to treat film as just one example of a wider set of looks. But to do this, we needed to gain a deeper understanding about perception and preferences. This is why we also gave so many talks in the past about little topics around that kind of thing here. I give a few examples. So it's basically kind of a recap of the last 10 years, just on a 5-minute kind of recap. We were debating a lot about skin tones. How is it possible that skin tones are shaped for different regions and cultural preferences on the one side, but even if you mix and match different print stocks that were done for different regions and different preferences, but still, no matter how you mix and match them, you always had this enhancement in rendition in skin tones. So how is this possible to do that? This is also last year's talk. We went into looking much deeper into how we perceive things in a very abstract way. So what we do is, when we see the world, we try to get this big bandwidth of visual information, and we try to put this into boxes, into categories. And the closer than actual stimulus is to a certain box, the less we need to abstract and process the image, and the nicer that whole perception thing goes, without the smoother it goes. And that also leads to the explanation why strong stylization is actually very pleasing to look at, because the closer something is to a prototypic representation, the less we need to do to to reduce the variety of that information in there. So, and we see this also in film. Film has some sorts of stylization process. It will compress certain color volumes and unify them. And typically, a film rendering is always a little bit of a stylized representation of the scene. We looked at in details about skin tones that we found out that even skin tones, and this is not something we found out, but we found the research about that the more homogeneous a skin tone is, the more healthy a person looks like, because a homogeneous skin tone suggests a good blood flow, and we are triggered to identify healthy people, because and there's in our lizard brain a reward function that sends, please reproduce in a very abstract way, of course. But we see, like, if there's a homogeneous skin tone that looks preferred. There's also an example from last year where I tried to visualize this. So if we take this image, for example, and we don't render this with a film rendering, but more with a rendering transform, which tries to not do those stylization transforms. And now what in the next image, what we do is we take the eyes, and under the eyes we tint that thing a little bit green, and we take another shape on the nose, and we make the nose a little bit red. I know it's very mean to do that, but just to make the point that you immediately pick up that variation in the magenta green dimension we are very sensible, and now she looks like as she was going out with us yesterday evening and having a hard party, and probably haven't slept that much or that well. But now if you take this image and we apply a filmic rendering to this data, we see the contrast changes, but what you also should see is that the compression along the magenta green axis is really reducing those variations and make the skin tone more even, therefore renders her skin more healthy. And it's not much if we just go in here, and you see that when we apply that, I think that it's a Kodak rendering. It's basically that compression orthogonal to the thermal locus. That's the black body curve. This is where all of the skin tones are spread across, a little bit below that, and that elongation along the thermal locus, that is very characteristic of film, and that kind of is like a digital makeup. So if you render a digital image through that pipeline, that makes the image more preferred. There's interesting studies that the faces are so important, and actually the area that is activated in our brain when we see faces is as big or even bigger as the area which is mapped to color processing. So for us, color and faces are two orthogonal and equivalently important things, and that's why having color and faces together is like a lot of activation. This is why we spend so much time getting the skin tones right here, because we are very sensitive for those arrangements of pixels. We talked about, when we looked at film, we found that there's a correlation between luminance, hue, and color purity, and if you follow that link, you will come to another camera image talk we did in 2018, where we talked only about this slide, 1.5 hours. So there's a natural correlation between how pure a surface color is and how bright it is. If you can spectrally prove that, to say, like, if something is more spectrally selective, the more energy it absorbs, the more photons go inside that object, and the fewer photons are reflected, and that makes the color more pure, but on the same time also darker. Because if you have like if you only reflect a portion of the light, then compared to a white piece of paper where it reflects all of the light, that saturated green needs to go darker. And we found out that this curve here is a boundary between surface colors and brilliant colors. And sometimes when you look at an image and you feel that the saturation is too bright for that saturation, that's basically when you violate that boundary here. It's called brilliance. This is an image here from bricks, where the RGB values of the yellow patches here are all the same, but this looks almost fluorescent or light emitting, because compared to the established white, this is technically too bright to be a surface color. So it looks like it's emitting colors. And when we look at data that comes from cameras, then cameras, if you turn them on, they violate those laws, because the cameras are not perfectly matched to the human eye. So and by that faulty mapping from the camera observer to the human observers, they introduce errors, especially in saturated colors. And this leads to, you take a camera, you render it with a clean image pipeline, and then those colors might look too bright for the saturation. And for example, here, if you look at the reds here, and we have modeled that surface area here, and if I now reduce the colors to that boundary, you can see that already that small edit will ground the image into physically plausible reality, and that's very important also when we do color grading. So if, for example, because we can violate this behavior easily. So for example, if we have that image here, and now I apply some saturation, and I'm not a colorist, so I can crank it up here without losing my job. So if I move this out here, of course I'm getting also some gamut clipping here, because I'm just moving it out of the display gamut. But you can also see that at some point Chappie's arm doesn't look like a metallic object anymore, and also that thing here, and the green grass in the background, and also the skin tone starts to almost glow or emit some light. It looks very unnatural. And this is something that happens quite quickly, and we subtly, it's very subtle, but we pick that up if the image we are seeing is physically not plausible. Now when we apply one of those film looks, because film cannot produce those colors based on the way it produces colors of its subtractive nature, it cannot produce those colors. So in a way, then that look heals those colors, and that's why also it's nicer to grade through such a transform, because it keeps the colors grounded in physically plausible regions. Another thing we looked at in details are S-curves. If you look at film, everything, when you measure any attribute of film, you always see S-curves in the correct contrast characteristic curves of the negative, of the print positive. If you look at a density tracking, if you increase the density in one layer only, and you look how the saturation curves, it's always like S-curves everywhere. So we made a table and said, like, okay, if we compare film and digital, why is film against digital so much better? Let's try to formulate this a little bit. Film is stochastic, digital is deterministic. I didn't make a slide about this because that would be way too nerdy, but just like, so we skipped that one. Film has an exceptional skin tone rendering. If you do a digital pipeline, you always have this uncanny feeling of like, that take a picture with your iPhone and like, and it's just like always this, So film is subtractive color mixing, digital is additive color mixing. No matter how often you write, I'm doing a subtractive saturation thing, that's more wishful thinking than, because digital color grading can only be additive. In its core, film has domain crosstalk, and Andy did a great talk where he spent like 20 minutes about domain crosstalk and how in on film, you cannot change only one parameter. When you shoot a lot of light onto film, it will scatter within the film, and then the more light you have, the more consequences that yields. And this is what we actually are seeking, like this halation and how the texture is depending on the contrast. That is domain crosstalk. And in digital systems, we made digital systems by design that you don't have an interference between dimensions. If you click an Excel sheet on disk, you don't want that suddenly, only because you typed in a number, in another Excel sheet, values are changing. So we made the digital computer really so that there is no domain crosstalk. So we can go into the green channel on one pixel and change that one value alone without affecting anything else. That's not possible on film. Film has S-curves everywhere. Digital systems, in some digital systems there are S-curves, but we engineer the hell out of those systems so that the response is linear. So this is really a one property where we try to establish linearity as much as possible in a digital system. So now you could ask yourself, and we ask ourselves, are all of those features engineered by the film manufacturers? Were they secretly in the labs, like drawing S-curves and said, like, okay, we need to put this S-curve into this, and then, yeah. So, and the answer is no. They were lucky. S-curves is not a property of film alone and only film, but you can see S-curves emerging out of nowhere in many systems, like CRTs. CRTs had an S-curve behavior in the highlights. Tape saturation, same thing. When you saturate a magnetic tape, this is basically actually the magnetic hysteresis curve. That is basically what's happening, and it looks very much like what we see on film. Or if you talk to a guitarist and says like, okay, and ask what guitar amp are you playing, then she or he will say like, I play a Marshall or a Fender Valve amp, because when I crank up the saturation, or we will not probably say saturation, but the distortion is so cool. And that's basically when you drive a valve into saturation, you get these non-linearities that manifest themselves. We see, when we look back at the stupid pandemic situation, we saw that S-curves and the first derivative, which is a Gaussian curve, emerged out of nowhere. Suddenly in every newspaper we would read, flatten the curve. What kind of curve? Where did this curve come from? Suddenly we would look at like S-curves and Gaussian curves and so on. They emerged out of nowhere. If you look at economic systems, it's the same thing. So somehow those systems all produce those S-curves. And what has actually made us understand is it's not about film and digital color grading. It's actually about natural systems versus artificial systems. And I probably showed this before at some point, but I show you here the gamut of all possible colors you can produce on a P3 projector, and all of the possible colors you can produce on a print film. And thinking about natural and artificial, I don't need to tell you which point cloud is which, because you probably see the one looks very artificial, man-made, and the other one is almost potato-ish, naturally shaped like the kidney, and that's basically the film gamut. I love those plots, by the way. Okay. Yeah. So if we actually now make a new table, and we, instead of film, we swap it out with a natural system, and instead of digital we use an artificial system, we come almost to the same kind of table here. Natural systems are stochastic, artificial systems are typically deterministic. Again, I don't want to go into those details, but natural systems are complex in a way that there are many interactions, and often these interactions are simple, but just the sheer amount of those interactions make this a very complex systems. Artificial systems are typically, compared to natural systems, very simple. Natural systems all have domain crosstalk. You always need to trade one dimension versus another if you want to optimize a natural system. In an artificial system, you have no interference between dimensions. In natural systems, you have things emerging like percolation. If you do a drip coffee and you count the drips you put into a coffee and then the drips that come out, you will get basically the toe of film. Because at the beginning you put in one drop and nothing happens, and then you put another drop and nothing happens, and then at some point, and then it goes into one-to-one relation, and then, yeah, that's percolation. An effect of that happens in many natural systems. Yeah. So how can we bring, that was our mission, so how can we bring a natural behavior to digital systems? The first thing what we did is we choose and stick to a leitmotif. That's very important that you don't constantly, only because you can do something in a digital computer, it's not that you constantly change between design goals or leitmotif. So we wanted to choose and stick to a leitmotif, limit ourselves to that. Introduce intra and interdomain crosstalk, and also limit the formulas we apply to the data to only those which are physically plausible and continuous and smooth. This is a very small subset of what you can do on a computer. On a computer, you can do whatever you like. You can do a step function. You can do all sorts of mathematical expressions. But in natural systems, typically, there's a very, very limited subset of things you can do. And we limit ourselves to those, to a hand-selected subset of functions. And about the leitmotif, we stick to the human visual system because that, in our sense, is a logical consequence of what we're doing anyway within Baselight for many years. We have our primary grading tool, which works in an abstract cone representation that's basically simulating the energy that goes into our eyes. And then in our human visual system, the image is further transformed in a different representation, in an opponency representation, where one signal is represented by the swing of color around one axis, that's the greenish, reddish axis, and another signal represents the swing around the yellowish, bluish axis, and then there are a few other signals that represent basically the gradients in contrast. And we stick basically to this part, and Chromogen, that tool Andy is going to show, operates in this opponency color space. And just as a lookout, because we also had this yesterday at the end of the panel discussion talking about AI and machine learning. If you look at our human visual system and how the image signals look on further up the wetware, the internal representations are very familiar with the activation functions of deep neural networks. So I think it's a logical consequence that if we go up the brain, we need to also very naturally arrive at machine learning algorithms, because this is a very good model of how we process data. All right, so finishing that off, so the digital Chromogen, we thought, so what are these two bubbles? The one is natural system design versus artificial system design, and the video look, the digital look, and the unity mapping. That means like if you do the color management just right, but without any further tweaking, you get this uncanny artificial looking, we call this here unity mapping. And then you have natural system design, and I tried very carefully to do overlaps that mean something. So Chromogen is a natural system design which is influenced by the human perception. Of course, it's not a one-to-one fit, because the human perception is so complex, and we have actually no clue about how this actually works. So we were inspired by that, but we are not claiming that Chromogen is a match to the human perception. But we hope there's a big overlap, and there's also a big overlap to film looks, and there might be some looks you cannot produce, which you can produce on film, but there is a great overlap of that. So this is kind of the introduction to it, and I switch over to Andy, and he will actually show to you how this looks like and what we came up with in terms of algorithms, and I shut up now, sorry.
Thank you very much. A very great introduction, Daniele. And I guess now now all of us are excited to see how does it actually work in a practical tool.
No pressure.
And that's then usually my area of expertise, applying it then to real images and see what we can do with it. So the Chromogen tool in the new Baselight version, I applied it here to already a set of images from a feature film that I graded a few years ago. And what I prepared here so far is not apply anything in the Chromogen tool. I just applied on the shots a basic white balance and exposure correction. So I can show that, for example, here, so that that shot came in a little bit bluish, and for that look depth, we don't try to bias the look towards like a white balance mismatch situation of the scene. So what I'm trying to do there is just to balance the shots in general to a neutral starting point, but I'm not doing any contrast changes or other kind of complex grading. Basically just exposure and white balance corrections to get everything to a neutral level, because our look that we're going to develop for a specific show, so that's what I'm simulating here today, that we would say, okay, so what if we need to develop a look now for that project here, is not biased or then overfitted to a certain white balance mismatch. It should work on all natural neutral shots. And in the final grading, we will then do something similar. We will first adjust exposure and white balance, of course. Okay, so that's about the setup. And also this is a setup that we would generally recommend for a look dev session like that, to put in a selected set of scenes from the project. And what we additionally recommend, what I don't have here today, is to add another, maybe a small set of maybe test images that you know pretty well, or that contain maybe some more difficult or extreme cases. So the more things you put in to test the look against, the more robust and generic it will be. But in the end, you want to really focus it on the current project and make these, or you should prioritize the footage from the project that we're going to work on. And okay, so in the Chromogen, when we insert the tool, we start with a page like that shows us a lot of presets that we built into it. And so that's one of the ways you can use the tool, is you can apply one of these preset looks to it, and then actually under the hood we then applied a whole set of small stages to the image. But that's not what we want to do today. But I also see that as a very typical use case. You apply a preset, and then you just go in and say, what could we do here? We could then say, okay, I'm not so happy with the yellow brightness. That should be a little bit brighter. And then we can then go in and adjust things here, or and then further tweak that. But in our case, we want to start building a look from scratch. So I'm skipping the presets and now starting with a clean slate. And the Chromogen tool consists of 10 sub-tools. We call them stages, in that case, that are made for look development. We have the first 4 here, the color saturation, color crosstalk, highlight, bleach, and contrast boost. And these 4 we consider really essential for almost every look that we're building. And then we have brilliance reduction and neutral tint, that we also think are very general, but not necessarily required for every look. And then we have 4 sector tools, which are then focused more on a certain color sector. So that is then only half of the color space or color palette. So basically the first 4 are more broader strokes, and this is then already going a little bit more to finer brush strokes. Because what we want to do in the work is we start at a very macro level, and then we go step by step more from the macro to the micro level. But then at one point it stops for the look, because then continuing then grading individual shots, this is then when we go very, very more into the micro level in the post-production. But this is then the first step into that direction. Okay. So I would say we start with the first, so I tried to cover most of these operators today. So, let's see how far we can go time-wise with that look. So the first operator I want to show is the color saturation. So here I have these sliders and I can move them over and hopefully you can see it makes the image look more colorful and more saturated, or also desaturated if I go the opposite direction. Also, we should maybe have a quick look here at the bottom, what we can see here. So on the right side, we always see representation or visualization of the current used operation. In that case, color saturation shows us a top view onto that opponent color space. I guess it's a cardinal color space. And so here, if I increase or decrease the saturation, we can see, so this is basically just a scaling up or down of in these two dimensions. And here on the left, we have a 3D representation of that. So if I would put it like this, so now it would be almost the same as this one if you're looking from the top, because here we have the added luminance or brightness component here in that axis. And the right side always only shows us the effect of the currently selected stage, and the left side always shows us the net result of the complete look that we built, because we're going to add a lot of these stages. And that's actually also one of the secrets of the ChromaGen tool, is that so that each tool by itself is actually quite simple. We can also see here the color saturation tool does not have too many sliders, but the complexity of the look then emerges out of the combination of a lot of these simple tools with each other. So, so we call that, I guess Daniele once called it complexity through numerosity. So we're adding a lot of simple things, and out of that emerges something very complex. But that's also good for us working with it. We don't want overly complex tools. We want to have simple things to work with. Okay. So, so far the color saturation tool does not see like, I would say, groundbreakingly revolutionary, or like a big revolution. It just adds more colors. But let's have a look at it in another color space, because this now here represents the internal working color space of the ChromaGen tool, which we call EAB. That's a space that we developed for scene-referred grading in an opponent space. But we can also have a look at that operation here just for educational purposes in an RGB cube, so if you're familiar with that. So now we're seeing it in an RGB color space where the luminance is basically the diagonal that I try to put now here in on the y-axis, and the colors are the sides of the cube, the axis. And so now if I'm adding saturation with our ChromaGen saturation tool, we can see it's a very complex operation in RGB that we're experiencing here. And also if I'm desaturating in that space, we can also almost see that that potato shape that Daniele showed a few minutes before. If we sand off here the harsh corners, we can see that the desaturation also brings us naturally to that shape or very close to it. So that should illustrate that it already has not a typical RGB saturation feeling. It already has a what we call more natural feeling to the image. So the next thing that we want to do is we want to ungang these two X and Y axes. So one here is the green magenta axis. So I can increase the saturation only in that dimension or decrease it. And the other one is the, let's call it the blue-yellow axis. And so that's already a nice thing to have. So because Daniele already mentioned, we really like maybe a nice saturation across the blue-yellow, blue-orange axis, but green-magenta, especially when we are hitting skin tones, we're very sensitive, and that's always, I guess a lot of colorists here today, that's always the tough shots for when there is one of the, if the fill light has a green or magenta spill in it and everything, that's always hard to grade. And so, but also as a general preference, we often like to have maybe a stronger amplification of that blue yellow against the green, magenta. We can even rotate the space in that also. So if I'm now doing it a little bit harder here, we can see, you should be able to see down here that we can then decide, okay, which specific color do we want to stretch out towards. But the preset, to be honest, I usually almost always use the normal preset. Okay, so what are we going to do here? Yeah, so we're adding, so I'm now adding a lot of saturation. You will also see in a few moments why I'm doing that, but maybe a little bit less for the green magenta. But now we're really at an oversaturated stage here. And the next thing, but then we see the effect of the other sliders better. That's why I'm doing it now. So the next thing we can decide about the saturation is where do we want to put or reduce it more in the highlights. So we can basically add more saturation to the highlights, or in that case, we can see that, yeah, the added saturation is now not added to the shadows, it pulls it out. Or what we typically, if we add saturation, what we typically prefer is we're adding it only to the, or mostly to the shadows. And of course with a smooth roll-off with one of these natural functions that Daniele described. Then we have a pivot here, so we can decide, okay, at which point in relation to middle gray do we want that tool to kick in. But in the end, adding more saturation mostly to the shadows is generally a good idea. And for me personally, the coolest slider in the saturation tool is the chroma slider. With this slider, we can focus the saturation more on just the saturated colors here on the left side, where the colors are more saturated. So that means only add saturation to already saturated colors. That's what I'm doing now. Or the opposite way, which makes more sense for adding saturation, only add the saturation for the colors that aren't that saturated. And that's a typical task that I personally, as a colorist, already thought about for 10 years, and always thinking, why can't I have a tool that just adds the saturation more to the desaturated colors? And I mean, it's not so trivial to build. Also took us a few years, as you saw, but it's really cool to have that. Because what I personally, as a colorist, always typically are looking for when I think about the color volume cloud on the scopes, like on a chromaticity plot like this, or the typical vector scope, we're always looking, or at least I personally was always looking for to have it as big as possible. I always wanted to have that really compact, or like really filled up circle, but without the extremes spiking out, because they are then always disturbing. So we want it to be as large as possible, but really nicely centered off on the side. So I'm always more thinking in these graphical ways. And this is exactly what we can achieve here. So this is the first part here, now adding the saturation only in the center. So we can see that we can add a nice amount of saturation. So now let's also see a before-after on that image here. But it's not really oversaturating the backpack here with that pink colors. Or let's have a look here. So I would say it's already a big improvement on these images, just seeing this amount of saturation added without overshooting too much. But still, on top of that, I would add another color saturation step. And I'm doing that as the very first step in our chromogen stack. Also, the chromogen stack, like everything in Baselight, there is that always that waterfall analogy, so it always flows from top to bottom. So we apply first that stage here, then this one, and then the color crosstalk is currently bypassed. So what I'm doing as the very first step is that centering of the spikes of our color volume. So I'm desaturating the image. Maybe not 100%, but quite a lot. And now I'm saying, but only for the very saturated colors. So now you can also have a look here at our point cloud on the scope. You can see it just pulls in these extreme colors that we're not usually, that then might be disturbing later in the actual grading, or then might draw too much attention from the people watching that. So on many shots, this will not have a strong effect. So we can see it's here. It's just pulling in these extremes, but in general, that's always a good step. And then just combining these two saturation stages now brought us already to a very good starting point, I think. But that's not where we stop. But I think maybe that sometimes if you want something very clean and not too filmic, that might already be enough for a project where people are just looking for a vibrant and colorful palette. But let's move on. So there's the color crosstalk operator already here in there, so I'm now activating it. And the color crosstalk is something also that we saw in the human visual perception. So when there's a really strong signal, or what Daniele described in my more like simple terms, is that the eyes perceive the colors in an LMS-ish space, but then the images are not transferred into the brain in that LMS-ish space, but in that opponent space. So we're then doing, like, I imagine, like 3 wires going then there. But if there's a very strong signal in one of the wires, it will then also spill into the other signals, because these are not electrical wires with like proper human engineered isolation. These are just organic, this is organic tissue. And so if there's a really strong signal in one of the wires, it will then crosstalk also into the other wires. And that color crosstalk in the opponent space we can simulate with that tool here. And so now we will see what it does. So basically, if I'm now, so here I can control the yellow to RG axis crosstalk and blue to RG at the same time. And what you can see is it's applying these tilt and shift effects to the color space. And also what we should notice, if I turn this a little bit here, is that this is also luminance dependent. So you can see here as a net result, so it's getting stronger with the stronger or brighter signals there. And what this is helping us is also shape a little bit the color palette. And I would say that's one of the more abstract tools where you need to build as a colorist a little bit of an intuition for it. But as a general guideline, I would say add a little bit of crosstalk, at least in the bottom row here, is usually a nice thing to do. Because what you can also see here on the chromaticity plot is, so there we have that thermal locus line that Daniele also showed us before. And if we're crosstalking here, you can see there we're building a little bit of a bias also onto that blue-yellow thermal locus axis. And then we can add, so typically, so that's my procedure, usually adding these two here in a ganged state, but then we can also go into each of these sliders here unganged, and then, so now you can see it's getting more precise. So now I can go in here and we see that. So this slider here is affecting more the green tones, so I should definitely go to a shot that has also more greens in it, and I put them to here more to the beginning of the of my test shots. So here's a shot that has some greens, so now we can see, okay, how does it affect the color of the greens? And so maybe I think, okay, so let's do maybe here a little bit of a negative crosstalk to have the greens a little bit more yellowish. And this slider here, we can see, okay, that really focuses more on the magenta red colors. So I should then maybe go to a shot where I have maybe a lot of skin tones and also something red. Yeah, so yeah, maybe let's go to this one here. So now we can see, okay, so we have that effect on the red. So these are really broad brush strokes, but the general principle is do as much as possible with these very, very broad tools, and then we can do some fine tuning in the next stages. So I'm always a fan of a little bit more reddish skin tones, not so yellowish, but that's all, of course, a personal preference, and also always depends on the on the content and on the set design, etc. So maybe I'll leave it like that for now in the color crosstalk, because we have a lot of other things. Next thing I'm going to add is a contrast boost. So this is a tool where we add contrast to the shot, and I personally think this is the best contrast tool that we ever built so far in Baselight, because as I raise the contrast boost value here, and you can see, as expected, it adds contrast. Not a big surprise, but if you ever worked in an HDR project, I mean, we can't show that here on the projector today, you know that adding with a usual contrast tool, contrast to an image is usually very difficult in HDR, because the highlights are usually affected the strongest if they're already bright. They're overshooting very quickly, and then you need to constantly fight against that, because we want to have the contrast here more in the midtones, especially on the faces, to get that more three-dimensional effect on the image, and to add some depth and perceived sharpness to the image, because sharpness is also a function of, especially of contrast. Oh, that is actually the whole chromogen already. So, but that's not only the contrast. I hope you can see that it adds a nice layer of depth, and also we realize that's what most of the film looks are also doing, is adding that little bit of a contrast boost. But in that case, as you can see here, so how do we read that plot? The green line is the unity of the tool. So this is where, if we do nothing, we have the green line, and if we're just raising the contrast boost, we can see here in the midtones, we're making the curve more steep, and more steep means more contrast. But at the same time, we're rolling it off in the highlights. And I just encourage you, if you're having, if you're playing with the new Baselight version with the Chromogen tool, yeah, just pop up a shot on an HDR monitor and then add that contrast. And I think you will hopefully see, as I did, it just works. And typically, I'm not tweaking here the other parameters of the contrast boost. So we have the possibility here to adjust basically the gray pivot, and also that highlight pivot, how strong we want to pull down the highlights. But I think the presets work pretty well. Another thing that I always wished for, so that's the slider that I'm sometimes touching, is that a chroma slider. So typically there are the two extremes with adding contrast. So either you're adding it in RGB. That's what, for example, if you're a Baselight user, that's what the film grade contrast is, for example, doing. But then when you add contrast, you all know that then you're also changing the saturation. If you add contrast, you add more saturation. At the same time, also there's some hue shifts happening. Then there's the other school, that's the base grade contrast in Baselight. There we're not changing the chromaticity at all, and but that can also feel a little bit unnatural. So if you reduce the contrast, the picture might look oversaturated, and in the end here we have a slider for that. So we can have basically the base grade school here is on the left. So now we're really adjusting only. So basically you can see the chromaticity here stays untouched. So if you want to have more like a bleach bypass, yeah, like silvery, high contrast look, I would go more into that direction. And here we have the film grade RGB school more on the other side. So now you can see when I add contrast, it also adds more saturation at the same time. And I can just tell as a personal anecdote, so this was a topic I discussed with Daniele for years, and I always came back to it and said, but what about the contrast? And so I'm not so really happy with our extremes. And in the end, what we realized is when we built the tool is that going exactly in the middle, so splitting the difference, like always in color grading, is the best solution. So our preset here is chroma on 0.5. And since we have that, I have to say I did not touch it that often anymore. So I'm finally now shutting up, and Daniele can focus on other things. Okay. But so let's leave it like that. So I think we have a nice amount of contrast added here. Of course, if you have really high contrast scenes here, I guess I have a shot here at the beginning. For this one, it might be a little bit too much, but this I would say is an outlier here, because here the scene contrast is quite high. And so we will probably in the grading then, on a per shot grading, maybe then reduce the contrast of that single shot. But as an overall theme on most of the shots, I think it's a nice, it's doing a nice effect. Okay, the next thing is the highlight bleaching. So that's also, I have to say that that's a tool that I personally severely underestimated, because I thought like, yeah, man, it's a desaturation in the highlights. So I've been there, done that, but yeah, Daniele really made me also completely rethink that approach with the tool that he and our other colleagues built here. Because the highlight bleaching, I also realized only a little bit later in the game, is a really essential component of filmic looks or aesthetic looks, etc. So first I'm raising the sliders here, and so we can see that now they're all ganged. So basically, if I'm increasing the highlight bleach, and we can also see that here in the sliders, left is colorful, right is white. So basically we're desaturating the highlights. So hopefully you can see that here, for example, on the background. And yeah, so far so good. And we have a pivot here. So where should that process start? And I think personally, I always like if it starts quite low and then has a very smooth kick in and not doing anything, and then suddenly just at the end kick in quite harsh, because then it might look weird on certain shots. So I'm always a fan of starting early with these roll-off processes. So that here in that case, we're starting 2 stops below middle gray and then smoothly going higher and higher. And this looks especially good, for example, when we have skin tones going into higher exposure values. Yeah, maybe here he gets a rim light there, and so we can see it's often helping with making this look much better. I mean, now I'm again overdoing it, so now we would say it's a little bit too grayish. But on the other side, at the end, I think I have a couple of shots. Yeah, with, for example, some skies in them, but now we also realize, okay, so now we're also losing the blue of the sky, so now you can barely distinguish here the clouds from the blue sky, which is a pity. And that's something where I was always unhappy with the print emulations. I was also like a super I was also always super loyal to my secret printlets, as Daniele described. But one thing I was never happy with is it was really hard through a printlet to have a nice blue sky in it. Basically, I always had to work really hard, lower the luminance, and push in so much blue digitally that it almost fell apart, and then it was not looking that great. But now in the Chromogen, this is one of the steps where I personally am really happy with. We can basically go in here and say, okay, let's do a little bit less bleaching here in the blues, maybe. So then we're just having an easier time with the blue skies. Also, we should probably see it here. So if I'm on the same level as the other ones, we have a more grayish sky, and if I just relax it here in that axis, that's something that's not too bad, and just means we have to do less gymnastics later, maybe overstretching the image to somehow fight against the desaturation there in the bleaching of the look. And another thing we might want to do is maybe bleach a little bit less for the yellows, so then we keep a little bit of the skin color in, but also maybe in general we're a little bit bleaching too much. So I'm taking it a little bit down. So what is it doing now? Yeah, but I think it really helps here. For example, you can see on the red on the forearm there, for example. That's why it's generally a good idea first with adding a lot of saturation at the top of the Chromogen stack, at least from my personal experience. And because then we're slowly, step by step, shaping off the things that we don't like. But it's always a good foundation to first throw the colors in and then, shape them off bit by bit. But of course, I mean, this is just my personal guideline that I developed in the last years, working with a lot of prototypes of the tool. But I'm personally most excited to see that, but also what all of the users out there will then come up with, probably with some really more inspiring ideas. So one thing that we are maybe not happy with is, so now that we added that highlight bleach, maybe we think, but it's now getting maybe too grayish there in the highlights, and so we like maybe that warmth a little bit. And so what we might want to do is maybe we want to not bleach towards the neutral axis. Maybe we want to bleach more towards maybe a little bit more warmish color. So we want to reduce the color variation there in the highlight spot, not to a boring gray, but more maybe to a nice warm orangish tone. And this is what we can do with. Now I go to the 2 optional stages that we have in Chromogen. That's a neutral tint. So these 2 ones, just as a recap, these are the ones where we say you don't have to do it every time, but can be essential for certain looks. And the neutral tint, again, is quite simple, and also we always see basically the same parameter space. We always have that chroma slider, the pivot, the fall off, etc. And so here we have, as a primary selector, we can select the hue that we want to add as a tint. And then we have the amount slider, which is a slider that goes into the negative and the positive range. And here from the slider color, you can see that if I'm going here to the right, we're adding the tint to the highlights. And if I'm, and then more and more, the further I go, and if I move the slider to the left, also hopefully we can see that here on the 3D plot, you can see, so now I'm adding the tint to the shadows. And so in that case, we want to add the tint to the highlights. And first I'm doing it really, really strong because I want to fine tune first the hue. So that's how I typically do that. And so then I say, okay, so yeah, maybe, actually the default was already not too bad. Maybe going somewhere here and then not overdoing it, just adding a little bit, then it might really work well with the bleaching. And this is one of the points where the order of operations has a really big impact, because here it really makes a difference if you're first tinting and then bleaching, because then the bleach will be still towards the neutral axis. Then in that case we will then maybe just tint it first, but then still shape it off with the bleach towards neutral. In that case, I'm bleaching first and then taking the result of the bleach and moving that one over. So then now we're really more shifting the our highlight color as a global thing. And that's also what we should see here. If I'm adding more and more of the amount here, you can see that our cloud or our tower here is then shifting more to the side. But also what we generally don't want to do is if something is really, really strongly orange already, we don't want to shift it that much, because maybe we are then pushing it outside of our display gamut, because the Chromogen tool has no idea, or there's no concept of a display built into the tool, so that the Chromogen tool does not know what Rec 7 or 9 or P3 or these gamuts are, because these are artificial systems that we built, or that the humans engineered. And so it's easily possible to basically overshoot over the display gamut. And to avoid that, we can use a little bit of chroma here. So we can say only tint the not so saturated colors and then slowly fade off the effect for the more saturated colors. So that's also already built into the preset, and that's working quite well. And to counter that, we can add, I mean, it's not too creative, but let's add another neutral tint, or maybe I should now start also to name my stages, because that's also high recommendation from my side. If you start working with Chromogen, always name your special stages. I mean, these ones here are quite trivial to understand if I will reopen that look in 2 months, but still it can sometimes help. So I would now say warm highs here, and now being super creative, cold lows. And let's add a little bit of complementary color here to the shadows. So I'm first doing it really strong. Also, what I personally always like is to have a strong overlap between processes. In that case, the tints. So maybe here, starting with the warm tint for the highlights, quite low, and starting with the cold tint for the shadows above that, so that there's basically that overlap of the two smooth things. I think that's usually what works quite well. So now we need to pick that, our cold color, yeah, maybe something like that, and then do it much more subtle, of course. But I think this also then adds like a nice separation here in the shadows. And you can see then often these are then very small and subtle things for an individual image, but then if we add all of them up, it's then really helping. Or here we can also, I think, see that it adds a little bit of depth. Maybe let's fine-tune the color here a little bit. Okay, so how does it look so far? So that's now, I'm just now toggling with and without the look that we built so far on the images. Okay, so here we have some green spill coming in, but that's something that we probably need to fix in the actual grade of the scene. That's why also I put that example in here, because we can see here the color is neutral, but here there was some green curtains, I guess, when we see the other angle there, and then we need to decide, do we want to do that or not? Oh, actually, sorry, I was now skipping just my white balance. I thought like, oh, I expected a little bit more. Okay, so here we now see this one. Yeah. This is how it looks. Okay, so this one is, I guess, shot through a polarizer, so that sky is a little bit dark, but that's also then something that we will probably then need to fix in the grade. But because that sky here is actually quite bright, so I could go in and say, let's do the blues brighter, but then we would also lose that sky here even more. So I think there's always that stuff that we're going to do in the grade and that are not part of look dev. Yeah. But I think in general we are going into a good direction. So the next thing to do is, I mean, there's a few topics that we can cover, but one very important one I would say is now doing a special treatment for the skin tones. I mean, Daniele talked about how it's often something preferred to reduce the color variation in flesh tones. And of course, we also have a tool for that. And so now we're going into these sector tools. And they are all working on a specific sector and doing a color sector of the color space, and they're doing different things. Like one can change the brightness of colors, saturation. We can skew them. That's basically, let's say, shifting the hues, and we can squash them. And the squash is now the one that I want to show, because there it's easiest to explain what it's doing visually. And also what I would now do is I would now put all these sector tools more upstream of my highlight bleach. So I want to do all these sector operations before I'm bleaching off the colors, where I still have all of the scene-referred color volume available. So as a general guideline, I would recommend that. If I'm doing it before or after the contrast boost, I would say it's not really making a difference. But typically, I would do these sector things before my bleaching and then final tinting of the bleached image. So, okay, so what does a sector squash do? So one thing I can do is here just move that squash slider all the way up, and you can see here on the visualization of the tool is it compresses all of the hues in a sector to one specific hue. And if we are now zooming into the skin here, so we can see that basically it reduces the color variation in that area. I mean, here it doesn't look really good. It's maybe a little bit greenish, I would say. And of course, we can select the hue where we want to squash towards to. Or we can also, all of these hue sliders, we can also always use with a picker. So we can go into the image and say, so this is the color that I want to squash towards to. And so now hopefully you can see that this reduces the color variation in that part of the color palette, and then it adds that small abstraction layer instantly to the image. I think with this kind of post-apocalyptic scenery, we're instantly getting that one step further away from a news broadcast and one step closer to that maybe epic apocalyptic or post-apocalyptic story here. And of course we're losing a little bit of saturation in the lips, but I will also talk about that in a moment. But that's maybe not always the thing we want to do. We can also do the opposite. We can also say, okay, so let's do a negative squash, basically. Let's spread out the color details, because that's, I think, sometimes can also be a nice thing to have if you have a really great looking actress or actor and with great makeup, then maybe you want to really amplify the fine nuances that they put there with the makeup. So hopefully I'm now bypassing this, and hopefully you can see that it's now also, or you can examine it here on the scopes, it's now amplifying these small nuances. And so, but now in that case, let's go more for a squash. And with the chroma slider, we can now say, okay, so let's squash more towards the not so saturated colors. So if we have strong red lips, then we can focus our squash really more on just the flesh tones and leave or let's go to a shot where we have her red piece of cloth here in the frame. So now the sector squash should not affect that one too much here, because I'm now already raised the chroma slider to say, so for the saturated colors, don't do so much of the squashing. And I guess hopefully you can also see it here on that thing. Or now, if I'm now just moving the squash, how it affects here that bird's eye view on the color space. And that squash can also be used to create really interesting looks. So we also used it in the presets to do things like something like only in the highlights concentrate all the colors to something like this specific red and this green or something. Or I guess it was the other way around. And in the shadows, we built a look where in the shadows we compressed towards red, green, blue, like the primary additive colors. And then we made a smooth transition for the highlights. We compressed towards cyan, yellow, and not magenta, because everyone always hates magenta. So then we then had that weird transition of hues going along the luminance axis, which also makes interesting effects. And that are not so this is not following any principle, maybe from film necessarily, but just playing with the available parameter space and thinking a little bit outside the box compared to established processes. Okay, so now we have that squash for our skin tones, and so that's a great tool also to work on that. And another thing, if we now go more to the green colors, is that maybe our greens are still a little bit too green for that kind of scenery. So what we could do is we could add a sector skew. So instead of desaturating them, I first want to skew them to a little bit different color. Or actually, I should also, being a good role model, I should label my stages here, skin squash. And so let's say here, bright green skew. We could also label it maybe green to yellow, because that's what I want to do. So now I can pick the green here and now squash it more towards yellow first. Let's do it really strong. And again, maybe let's start with the pivot a little bit lower and focus it basically mostly on the highlights. So now we get a little bit of color variation, so that the dark greens are not skewed, but the brighter they get, then they get more yellow. And I mean, that's, I would say, a little bit maybe too radical here, but goes into the right direction, and maybe fine-tune that. And one thing, just as a best practice for working, is what makes sense is to typically group the shots in your look depth timeline with so that shots with maybe similar primary colors or dominant colors in the frame are next to each other. And so here I have, for example, so most of the shots that have a lot of green in it, I have next to each other, because when we're then going into the sector work, it's then always good to check the different shades of green that we have in our project. And so Daniele has like his big master timeline where he has red, green, blue, cyan, magenta, yellow, gray, and all of the big, important colors, and with some good example shots from various productions, if you want to build like a very generic look. So now we have, so now I think it's definitely helping here, skewing a little bit towards yellow. And also I see maybe I should wrap it up in maybe 5 minutes. So let's add a few more sector things that I think are maybe still necessary here. So one thing that I'm missing is, I mean, you haven't seen that movie, but actually that red piece of clothes of the girl is, that's basically part of her character. So maybe we want to give a little bit of push to that. So I'm adding a sector saturation thing. Again, putting it somewhere here. And now I say, let's call it dark red boost. And so we're going into the reds. We're increasing the saturation. Let's first overdo it a little bit. And then we say, okay, so mostly boost up the more saturated colors, because I don't want to boost up necessarily the skin tones too much, so it have a stronger effect on the saturated colors. and a little bit effect maybe on the skin tones, and only do it here, only do it in the shadows. And now let's reduce the effect, like so. Let's zoom in and hopefully we get, so we get that nice boost. Of course, we can also see collateral effects here on other things that are red, but that's the nature of working like that. And that's also what makes the stuff look natural, not fall apart, because we're not doing these surgical operations. We're doing these very smooth and broad things, and adding lots of them together then gives us a nice final result. And also, hopefully, one thing that you saw is that while playing with all of the different tools, we might had some situations where the image didn't look that great, but we never had a situation where it completely fell apart or where it looked like digitally ugly, over-processed in a way like that. And yeah, so I think getting there, just thinking maybe some of the greens. What about this one? Yeah, I think to get a little bit more richness in the picture, maybe we can darken a little bit off these greens. I have a little bit of the feeling that they sometimes that they look a little bit grayish, but I don't want to oversaturate them, so I would add a sector brightness. I think that also we didn't do that yet, so let's call it greens darker. Pick our hue and pull down the brightness. That's, oh no, actually, I think we can focus it maybe a little bit more towards the highlights. And, oh, sorry, that was the whole bypass. So that's now only doing the brightness. Maybe let's fine tune a little bit the color here. And then relax it a bit. So I think hopefully here on these opening shots with lots of foliage, it's now, having a nice effect. I mean, maybe in that case, now I'm thinking the green is a little bit oversaturated, so I'm adding another sector saturation there. And I guess after that's the last sector to add for today. I'm picking the green, desaturating, mostly in the shadows, I would say in that case. At least it looks to me more stranger in the shadows, and maybe also more focused towards these more saturated colors. Yeah. And what I'm typically also then doing as a very last step maybe not from the look dev session, but from the processing, is adding another color saturation here at the bottom, and just again shaping off a little bit the extremes of what we did so far. So I'm doing basically the same thing that I did here in the beginning, desaturating, but only the saturated colors. And you can again see here on the scope how it pulls in these very extreme colors, and I think that's always then having a nice effect. And on many shots it does not have a big impact, but helping then on the extreme shots. Okay, so that's the look that we built now, and I want to show one more thing, or give you one or two pieces of advice. So one is, so far I never showed it on that shot here, on that night shot. And so there I would say, and this is also the experience that I made with using the tool on real projects, is there's then always these scenes where the look that we built is not fitting perfectly. For example, here I would say that night scene now looks really oversaturated to me. And in the old days, when we had a show look baked into a LUT, we then always basically had the two options. First, we try to somehow work around the LUT, then maybe keying back something from not processed by the LUT into the image, or somehow shaping the image prior to the LUT in an unnatural way so that it then flows through better. Or the other thing is that in very extreme cases, I also had to do that sometimes, then throwing away the show look LUT and then doing the night scenes without it at all. But then it's really hard to make your scene fit into your movie and fit into the world that we created with the color palette. And what I realized is in all of the projects that I did so far with the Chromogen is I had at least one scene, usually even 2 or 3 in the movie, where I then went in and just did a tweak of the look that we built. So here we could go in and say, maybe let's don't do the dark red saturation boost, and maybe we don't add so much here of the color saturation. So I don't want to, I mean, we would then just reduce it here for that particular scene. And then we still have our general look and our world and our rules. Basically, the color rules of our world that we established apply to the image, but just maybe not in such a super strict way. And having that flexibility going in to certain shots, especially night shots, or I had in another project, I had a nightclub with some neon lights, is really helpful. Or actually, now I'm just thinking about when I say neon lights, I forgot to add one stage.
Yeah, okay, yep, go for it.
A very important one. Okay, so we have a few minutes left. But you can see that I didn't prepare the look, so I just thought let's freestyle something here. Okay, but to finish the point is first that, and then I will add the last stage that is still missing. Is that it's really great having for these specific scenes. In my cases, these were mostly night scenes and or nightclub or something. But in one case also there was another scene where just the set design and the colors that we had in the frame did not really play well with the look, and from that specific location, then we tweaked it. Or here we have an example. For example, we have here that scene with the torches. Where basically in a cave, where then this then often the case where we then want to, where it's really great to have the flexibility to go in and tweak the look. And another point I want to make in that regard is what I also realized is that the look dev is for me never really finished. So I mean, you're doing that look dev session ideally before the shooting, and then you're baking it out as a LUT for use in camera and for the dailies probably. But then when you go into the final grading, or if the final colorist is also doing the dailies, it's then great to step by step in minimal steps evolve the look even further. Because the more images you see with your look, you're then realizing, I'm realizing on every shot, almost every shot, I'm doing the same grading tweak. And if I'm doing that then for a while, then I'm thinking, yeah, maybe I should improve the look a little bit into that direction, because maybe that's really what is still missing. So what I realized is I constantly updated the look almost until the last moments. I mean, in very small steps, of course, so it's not changing it dramatically, but that's also a very nice thing to have. Okay, but now there's one step that is missing, and actually I have to be at least I have an argument for myself, is that footage here does not really need it that much, and that's the brilliance reduction. So that's the thing that Daniele showed for these unnaturally saturated colors that are too bright for their saturation. So we have the brilliance reduction stage here. So let's throw that in, and let's move it more up where we still have a lot of saturation. So I would typically do it before the highlight bleaching. So I can now raise the amount to 1, and we can see in that case there's nothing happening, because in that, from the set design of that project, we don't have many colors that are basically too saturated for their brightness. I went to the shot here with the backpack, because if we now make the tool a little bit more aggressive, then we will see an effect here probably on the backpack, because here, I mean, that nothing, no color in these images looks like emitting light to us in like a glowy kind of sense. But here with the sliders, I can say, okay, let's focus a little bit more on also even lower saturated colors, and maybe also on a little bit darker colors. Now we can suddenly see an effect here. And so now with the brilliance reduction, we can see we can basically make these overly saturated colors a bit darker. But for that project here, I think it would not be as crucial. And that's probably also why I forgot it, because I had no visual clue reminding me of it. But I think it's still not a bad idea to have a little bit of brilliance reduction then built into the look. All right, yeah. So I think that finishes this look that we built here. I can also just show you one that I did here in preparation for the session. Yeah, so I would say it's a little bit more abstract than what we did here now, just live. But also not dramatically different. But here in the beginning, I built one that, just as another extreme example, I built one where I did something a little bit unconventional. So there I took the color saturation and I desaturated a lot, but mostly the desaturated colors. So basically I wanted to create that little bit gray world. So basically everything that is not very saturated gets gray and colorless, and only the saturated colors remain. And so that's also something, I mean, I would not necessarily do it, but just to give you some more ideas to think about what is all possible with the tool. And so that's something that I did here. So I made it first gray, then added some tints to that gray axis to make it even a little bit colder, etc. Okay, I think we have maybe 5 minutes for questions. And thank you for listening.
Yeah. Thanks, Andy. It was great. Also showing that the brilliance reduction doesn't do anything if there are no brilliant colors is actually a good thing, because you can have it in the look, but it does only operate if you have those colors in the frame. Are there any questions? Now is the time. Yeah, there's one in... Yes.
I think we should have maybe a hand microphone somewhere. Yeah, it's coming.
Hello, thank you for this interesting class. I have a little question, even though it's very, very basic, I'm quite sorry. But since you have a sequence of a film and you are coloring, I suppose, every image separately, no presets and nothing like this. So how do you keep the sequence coherent? If you're using some color palettes or some similar settings in every image?
I think that's exactly the point, to keep it coherent, that this becomes part of every shot. So that look you build is applied to every shot, and so every shot in a sequence gets the same characteristics, and that actually glues the scene and then the movie together.
So you can apply the same settings, or...
Oh, that's the point. Yeah, the point is that this look is then applied to a whole scene.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah. So basically, I've been treating everything through the look to basically apply I call it the color rules of the world that we're creating.
And if you tweak it, if you say, I think that you're pointing out what Andy said. If you then later tweak it, you tweak it for a whole scene, and so that it becomes always a coherent.
Yeah. Yeah. That's all.
Yeah, no, all good, all good.
No, all good. And also, that's also one point that I didn't mention, or I think maybe I forgot to mention, is that these are really, we see them as look development tools. We don't think that people will necessarily change them or should not change them on a shot-by-shot basis, so more on a scene-by-scene basis, or maybe use the same setting for the whole movie or whole project. And so these are not grading tools. So grading is making then the individual shot fit into the scene. And this is a different level. This is the look dev stage. So these are not grading tools, but look dev tools. Yeah.
There was another question over there. So we two questions. One.
Hello. Hello. Yeah, it's working. I was wondering, is this all happening in linear, and then afterwards you can adapt it to log or to a gamma referred space?
Yeah, the chromogen is color space aware. That means whatever your input or working color space is, it will always convert from that space into its internal representation, and it's an opponency color space, so it's neither a linear nor log space, and then it will convert back to where it comes from. So you can apply then the same look to all of your workflows and also camera material. So it's agnostic of the color workflow and the input and output color space.
Yeah, to put it in simpler terms, it's a scene referred tool. So you can imagine it as going from scene linear to scene linear with a look, but not clamping anything everywhere, anywhere. So it's not adding the conversion to Rec 709 or something.
So you can put out a linear show lot for VFX as well.
Yes,
of course. Yeah.
So it's all formula based in the end of the day, and you can, for preview purpose, make it scene referred to scene referred, or combine it with a LUT or with a DRT to.
For example, color nerds like for me it makes a really big difference that I know that the image that we're currently seeing on the screen is not touched by any 3D LUT anywhere. So there's no interpolation errors anywhere. So this is all processed just through formulas in 32-bit floating point. So that's often, you cannot usually show it directly on images, pinpointed to a certain thing, but it just gives a very good feeling about the image quality also. Yeah. I think there was another one.
Yeah, hi. I wanted to ask, because there's a matte tab and matte box, and I'm curious if you can use some kind of mattes, and what would be the use case scenario for look development and using mattes?
I think it's default. Every operator has a matte button here. I don't.
But there's also one. Oh, okay.
So that's basically just the baseline UI. So everything that you apply to an image, you can further restrict through a matte. So, but that's basically, so now I would apply that look only here through a shape, for example. But for look dev, I would not necessarily say that's.
Oh, maybe, I don't know.
Necessary. Actually, to be honest, I used it in a project. So I added basically like a smooth vignette and added a little bit color treatment for one scene for the outside and for the inside. But then I had a chromogen on both sides. Basically, I had an inside and an outside chromogen. They were very similar, just different in one parameter.
Well, why not? There's another question in the third row here.
Well, thank you. I would like to know if you will use chromogen in the color grading session, or maybe just for the look development. And also, I saw that you separate a lot the saturation, and saturation it's a bit destructive generally. It's the most destructive operation, I think. Maybe I am wrong, I don't know. But you start putting a lot of saturation, and we, as cinematographers, never be sure how much can we take off or take in saturation. So I see that you separate green a lot from magenta. So how is the limit? Maybe it's a question. Until you destruct your saturation.
So maybe I can answer the second one, and you maybe the first one about.
The first one was how do you, if you use it in a grading session. Yeah, so I think I see, that's what I outlined already in the beginning. I see two major scenarios. One is you do a proper look dev session, then you're maybe building it like I did today from scratch, and then really spending also the time. And I mean, now we had like 45 minutes today, but I would say it takes at least half a day to really flesh out a look for a new show. And hopefully you're paid for that, but that's also something that needs to be organized with the production, of course, and scheduled, etc. Or the colorists maybe just prepare it before the final grading starts. And the other scenario is you need a look quickly. Then you start probably with one of the presets and then just go in and say, yeah, okay, that preset is great. It's built after a certain film stock, for example. We have some presets in there, and then you say, but maybe just the yellows I want to have a little bit different for that project. So both is possible. And then what I really realized is that in either case, you then will, for long-form projects, come to certain scenes where you then go in and do some small tweaks, but then typically only then for the whole scene, maybe the whole night scene or the whole scene at a certain location, adjusting it in a small way.
And about breaking up the and fearing image tearing, I hope you have seen that you can move the sliders in very fast directions and add a lot of operations, and the image doesn't break. And that comes back to the design of of the algorithms, because every stage is a smooth operation, and if you add a smooth operation onto a smooth operation, the resulting operation is a smooth operation. Whereas if you have a non-smooth operation, only one will make the final look not smooth. So it's very easy to break a look by doing something that one thing that breaks continuity, and therefore the design is so it feels limiting. Maybe you see that you can do it to the shadows, but you don't have like Bezier curves where you can say like how steep, because this is actually the point in this look development thing, that you never can produce, or you need to do like really crazy stuff to actually make such a steep transform that it actually tears image data apart. So it's really, the parameter space is very inviting for exploration, because it never tries to break the image.
So if someone has a very urgent one, maybe a very last one, and then we wrap it up.
So there's one over there, I think. Steffen has a...
So just to wrap it up, the stages all add like individual transforms to the tool?
Yeah.
Or do they result in like one transformation that you then apply?
That it's basically technically the different transforms are stitched into one transform. Yeah. So, but it's a technical implementation which increases the processing speed. So we only upload the image once to the GPU, and all of those different stages become one stage on the GPU. But it runs through the individual formulas. But there's a lot of optimization you can do when you have two color saturation things and going on. So that's why you can add 50 stages and still have it in real time, because once it's on the GPU, it's basically for free. Nowadays, the GPUs are so fast. But it's not baked into a lookup table or something like that. It's processed in 32-bit.
Yeah, so it really makes a difference that you still have it all. If you're applying it through the chromogen operator, it's always processed in floating point as formulas.
Yes,
and so it's not reducing it to a 3D LUT internally. Yeah. Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much for coming.